Welcome to episode 46 of the FoodGrads Podcast, the podcast where we explore careers in the food, beverage, and agricultural industries. I'm your host, Veronica Hislop, a PhD candidate in molecular science and career partner with FoodGrads. This week on the podcast, I interviewed Melissa Norem, Enterprise Director of Origination at Scoular. The Scoular company is an employee-owned agribusiness leading the way since 1892. They buy, sell, store, handle, and process grain and ingredients by leveraging their global networks and expertise in international trade and transportation. In this episode, Melissa talked to me about her career journey as a 20-year veteran in the agricultural industry, with roles which have included trading, supply chain management, and business development. I learned more about what Scoular does and how they are supporting farmers and communities with their focused approach on relationships and innovative supply chain solutions. Melissa allowed me to pick her brain on some of the skills that are important in her role, particularly communication. We also dived into the topic about getting into the agricultural industry, even if you have no background in the field. Finally, Melissa taught me about grain production and what it looks like getting from seed to plate. This episode really opened my mind to learning more about the diversity of careers that there are in the agricultural industry and just how much you really can do. So, enough with that introduction. Let's get on with the show. Thank you so much, Melissa, for coming on the show. I am really excited to learn more about your role. I will be honest, I'm not as familiar talking to those who are maybe more progressed in a company with these types of titles. So it'll be really cool to see how your career progression led you to here. So thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Veronica. I appreciate you having me.
So to get us started in that, I just announced this role without actually talking about it. Could you tell me a little bit more about your current role at Scoular and what exactly Scoular is?
Be happy to. So my role as Scoular's enterprise director is really to lead thought process and action around our company's strategy and how we're going to serve our producers across our business divisions. And I have broke that out really in three different areas. First area is strengthening our producer relationships. And throughout this conversation, you might hear me say producers, farmers, growers, all means the same thing, but they're really at the heart of what we do at Scoular. And in this capacity of my role, I work to bring innovative ideas and solutions to our producers through our originators and traders. So we would have originators throughout the company that are talking to producers, buying their grain. And then we also have traders that would be talking to like the end users who are going to ultimately process that grain. I also have a producer origination team that I offer leadership to, and they are really focused on training and coaching and supporting all of our operations in the execution of these producer programs and technology. So that's the first part of my role. The second part is leveraging technology. And in this capacity, it's really thinking about equipping the producer to create and execute on opportunities that are a lot of times going to be in efficiency and analytics. So we want to enable the producers to be able to make informed, timely decisions that support the success of their operations. And then the kind of third piece of that three-legged stool is driving Scoular's presence in the supply chain. So when you think about that, you think about our collaboration with not only our originators that I mentioned, but then also the end use customers to think about what's possible in this fast-paced world of agriculture. Some of the examples are the ones that you might think of with a grain supply company like us, where it's the market knowledge, it's logistics, it's innovative solutions that we bring to problems. But it's also some of these up and coming items that are going to be really important in ag, and that's sustainability, traceability, soil health, regen ag, carbon. So that's what my role is today.
Wow, that sounds like it really encapsulates so many things. And before I start questioning you more on and breaking that down, for a lot of our audience is fairly new to the industry, the agricultural, the food industry, and they might not be too familiar with what Scoular is. Would you be able to just quickly talk about what they do?
Yes. So Scoular is an integral part of the supply chain. We deliver the solutions and really market expertise in not only grains, which is really where my background at Scoular is, but also food ingredients, feed ingredients, the animal feed, pet food, international trade, transportation. We're a 130-year-old company. So we were founded in 1892. We have company headquarters in Omaha, with also corporate representation in Kansas City and Minneapolis. We have about 1,200 employees, 100 offices spread out across North America and Asia. So really, when you think about what Scoular does, in some capacity, we are processing some things, but primarily we're in that supply chain on the logistics, on the market knowledge, and really on that expertise, bringing opportunities to our producers and our end users.
Okay, wow. While you're talking, it just sounds like you and Schooler are so involved in some I find it so hard to wrap my head around these types of just it really puts me in awe about the food chain and how we get the products to where we are, and there's so many intricacies that a role or someone takes in order to make everything work at the end of the day.
It's simple and it's complex at the same time. And I've been at Scoular 16 years. I've been in the grain industry 20. I am amazed every day just on how products get to our store shelves. Certainly with COVID, I think some folks got a glimpse of the complexity of that. And you just don't go to a grocery store and that's where the food is.
Mhm.
I think maybe that opened some eyes. But yeah, it's absolutely fascinating, especially when you think about the international part of that too. And that's really exciting as well.
Oh, for sure, because I know when I started, like, trying to research and learn more about different roles, and then I would get to the section when maybe it came to a buyer, but then it became a commodities manager, and then I'm like, "Why is there a difference?" And then it's just thinking about food in such a grand scale, it's again, it's amazing how things go, especially internationally.
It is. And ag is so not one dimensional too. There's so many capacities where we have just overlaps and partnerships with customers who are also sometimes competing with on maybe the origination side. And we welcome that. We welcome healthy competition. We appreciate being seen as a valued supply partner in maybe another capacity of that company's business. And it just all works, especially to circle it back to COVID. The fact that yeah, maybe your certain product was not on the store shelf for some time, but just for that piece to continue rolling, for us to continue to have food. And I haven't really even touched on the transportation piece. That's actually a part where Schooler really excels and really finds our niche. It's how we operate in the transportation model as well.
Oh, wow, that's really interesting because, of course, that is such a you need to get the food to the people, and I would have to be pressed to know, though, about again, this sounds like a very it's almost above my head, I won't lie with your role, I know you just broke it down for me, and it's just me trying to put the pieces, but I would love to know about the flow and how you ended up to this type of position because it sounds like it looks at so many different regions, and I would love to know how you got there. So would you be able to maybe walk us through a little bit about that career journey to where you are now?
Yeah, so I grew up on a corn, soybean, and hog farm in north central Iowa and absolutely loved my childhood on the farm. You know, wouldn't trade it for anything. I really respected the farming way of life. But I'll also tell you, this was in the late 80s and 90s, and farming was tough. It was very tough on my parents. It was very tough on our ag community. You know, I saw my parents work every day to not lose their land. And I had decided that when I was entering college in the late 90s that I did not want to go into agriculture. So I actually majored in economics. But then about 3 short years later, I interviewed with Archer Daniels Midland. So I'd say ag found me again. So I actually took my first role out of college was with ADM. And what I did for them is I was trading wheat midds, which is a byproduct of the flour milling process. So you take wheat, you mill it at the flour mill, and then you get flour. You get a product called clears, and then you also get wheat middlings. And wheat middlings are used for animal feed. So that's what I did for 4 years with ADM. And I just learned a ton about logistics, working with facilities, working with ingredient buyers, transportation, trucking companies, railroads. Not to take anything away from my education, but what I learned I could have never learned in a book. You know,
Mm.
I just had to learn it on the job. And it was a really steep learning curve, but it was also just really valuable in starting my career in the ag industry. And then, as I mentioned, 16 years with Scoular. So 16 years ago, I took the role with Scoular as a commodities trader. And I really liked Schoular's focus on empowering employees. So that's what really drew me to Scoular. In my time at Scoular, I've had a few different roles. So I first started out as a cross-country grain trader, which what that means is I wasn't necessarily buying or trading for any of our facilities. I was trading the commodities that would be marketed in a certain geography. So the geography I was covering was South Central Nebraska down through South Central Kansas. And the commodities I would have been trading were corn, soybeans, milo, and hard red winter wheat. So that was my first role with Scoular. A few years later, I took a role as a dried distillers grains trader, which that's also DDGs, if some of your listeners are familiar with that term. And that's a byproduct of the ethanol production process. And that was in Kansas and both Texas. So I got to experience some geographies there. And then I started working with the Rail Wheat Group. So in what that capacity is, I would have been buying grain from not only Scoular's facilities, so I would have been marketing for Scoular's facilities, but then also just third-party customers that we work with. So think of like co-ops or think of other grain entities that Scoular doesn't own, but I would be buying the wheat that they produced. And then my customer base was the flour milling industry. Primarily, my geographies that I was originating from were the Dakotas down through central Kansas. So most of that hard red winter wheat is generally pointed to the eastern part of the United States, give or take. Most of my customer base would have been not necessarily the customers, because a lot of times they were in Kansas City, Minneapolis, or Omaha. So I did that for several years. And I also throughout this time had some opportunity to work with our business development team. I would say not on an official basis, but more as opportunities came along. I can give you a couple examples of those. One of them, we were working with a longstanding customer to purchase their grain assets when the family decided to sell the entity. Another one was when we were asked to provide inbound grain logistics and outbound byproduct marketing. And I really appreciated the opportunity to work on that project-oriented work and start to fine-tune my communication and organizational skills. And then, as I mentioned, just this past August 2021, I took my current role. And this has really been a wonderful opportunity for me to combine my skill sets that I've garnered the last 19 plus years, and then also just my interests to bring together my passions for agriculture, strengthening the farmer, and then also just advancing Scoular as a leader in the ag industry.
That is so cool. And I can see now, as you're mentioning, hearing those different roles, working a little bit with the projects, how you start to pick up the pieces along the way and really get that whole view of the industry. And I know that, of course, that's always shifting and all of that, but I can see where those little seeds, so to say, are picking up.
No, you're exactly right. When this opportunity came, and I'll admit I didn't jump on it right at first because you do think, gosh, do I have the skill sets? Do I have the knowledge? And the more I looked at it, I said, absolutely, I do. I mean, I didn't know it, but this is my next opportunity. This is exactly what I need to do. And various folks at Scoular helped me think about that and think about that opportunity. And I'm really appreciative of that as well.
Thank you for being honest about that portion because as someone who's been more established in their career and was myself or maybe those listening, it's hard to, I think a lot of us tend to think that we're not ready for a role, especially
Yeah,
at
yeah.
university and college. But just to hear that, to be honest, that hesitation can be still experienced later on in someone's career. It's a little comforting to know that I don't mean to put it, but again, when I see these high roles, they just a lot of individuals, unless you talk to them one-on-one, they can seem so for removed from your sphere, to be honest.
Yes, totally agree. And we focus on talking about that at Scoular. We kind of call these
Oh.
stretch roles or stretch assignments, but I don't know that anyone ever really feels ready, or maybe they don't admit it, and they say they do. It's kind of that, thinking about, okay, my example that I gave you or examples in the business development, those different examples, I had no blueprint for that. And I just had to
Mhm.
jump in and learn. I had other experiences in my trade career that I had no blueprint and I had to figure it out. And just maybe some advice to folks to think about too, that sometimes the career path isn't always linear. I know maybe it sounds like mine is, just what I've described here too.
Mhm.
But there have been moves within my career that sometimes could have been seen as backwards. An example of that is within that rail wheat group, I worked my way up after the first few years to be able to trade my own P&L, profit and loss statement. So I was managing that P&L. I was successful in that. And we as a company a few years later decided that it didn't make sense to have that separate P&L away from a couple of the other P&Ls. So we decided to combine those. That consolidated P&L had a different management structure, and I was no longer managing that myself. And can honestly say I never looked at that as a step backwards because I knew that there were things I still had to learn. I knew that I could learn from the manager of that consolidated P&L. And I also knew that the dynamics of combining P&Ls versus working on your own, those skill sets needed to be developed for me as well. So I would also just maybe encourage folks to think about, it doesn't always have to be linear. Sometimes you take a sideways. Sometimes in this case, it might have seemed backwards from the outside looking in. I managed and then I wasn't managing. I really am confident that it's those opportunities that got me to where I am today.
You mentioned that Schooler does focus on communication and relationships within the organization and those with farmers. And what you were saying got me thinking about how you might have learned about that as you were going through your career. And I guess I just wanna talk a little bit more about that and how you navigated communicating to different types of people, especially in your role. You've had experience with the farmers, those who you've worked in same facilities, or even with outside companies as you're trading. So would you talk about if that was something that just came naturally, if you actively worked on it, or maybe just talk about Schooler's philosophy in that aspect?
Sure. Yeah, I'm a big believer that not only in professional life, but personal life, communication is number one. Regular communication, repeating main themes so people aren't left to fill in gaps. I think that is so important. And not only to maybe avoid issues or crises, but also when you come upon those, you're so much better adept to be able to talk through those if you have open lines of communication. As far as my career path in communication, I would say it was nothing formal that I did in terms of the communication, but I always really thought about, okay, when I talk, I want that to be of value. I don't want it to talk. I want to make efficient communication. So for example, email is not a conversation piece. Email is a way to get data across or to get short ideas, but not a conversation piece. I was once told if you get more than 2 or 3 emails in a back and forth, it's probably time to pick up the phone, or walk down
Hmm.
the hall or whatever it might be. So I think that's it. I also always really worked to anticipate the next question. So for example, if I was responding to somebody over the phone or let's say via an email, I tried to be really clear and concise and not leave them having to fill in gaps or then have to ask another question. So to me, that was also really important and the thing that I live and kind of work by. I have to change my form of communication style to some extent, depending upon who I'm talking with. But I also am really adamant that I'm going to be consistent and how you're going to see me is going to be consistent. I'm not going to be communicating one way or acting one way today. And then if I have an off day, I'm going to be that tomorrow. Don't get me wrong. You are going to see maybe some variables, but I just really work to be consistent in my messaging and how I talk to folks. And I think people have come to appreciate that and just to be able to rely on that with me.
That's an interesting thing to mention because that also leads me to thinking about one thing that had stood out about, I think it was in a news piece that had mentioned about you that in your role is that you're using technology to enhance relationships. And that stood out to me. Would you be able to maybe talk more about that?
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, technology's here. It's here for everything. It's certainly here for the ag industry. And when we think about that, it can sometimes feel like it's threatening, in terms of, Schooler works so hard to create these relationships. And I shouldn't say even works hard. I mean, it comes natural because this is what we do.
Mhm.
We serve our producers. We really work to create that relationship. And you can think of technology as threatening to that, but really, what we've decided to embrace is that it really just supports that relationship. The example I gave earlier, where we're looking to empower our producers, give them information on accounting, give them information on markets. You know, the producer is being tasked with more and more variables thrown at them, just given everything that's going on in the world, with less and less time to focus on that. So they are being challenged to embrace technology in their operations as well. So I talk with our folks that we need to do the same. Our producer base is having that same challenge. So, just to give an example of what we've done with technology, we have what's called Scoular View. So that's our producer facing suite of tools that we have available. It includes our customer facing website, it's our app, and then it's also our customer web portal. We're going to continue to build on those. I mean, I kind of say those are the 3 tools in our toolbox right now. We're going to continue to build upon those and what we offer within those. And that's just an example of, what we've done to embrace technology rather than to keep it on the outside looking in. Schooler in general, as a leader in the ag space, we've partnered with various folks to advance some technology, and not only on like the producer front that I'm talking to you about now, but also like on truck transportation. So we have some opportunities within that we've also advanced. We look at it as a way, same as I mentioned that the farmer is tasked with more and more things coming at him with less time and resources. We are as well. The labor force is very tight. We're trying to do more with as many folks as we can, but we know that we have to embrace technology to do that well. But a lot of that technology comes from folks sitting around and saying, gosh, wouldn't it be cool if we could do this? Or this is a very manual process that we do. Can we, bring some technology to this process? Or what if we streamlined this process and we could get that information to our producer faster, say tickets or settlements? So that's really a lot of times how the technology comes to fruition, is looking at, okay, what are the pain points in the process? And then what can we do to make those more efficient?
That's really good because again, it brings the farmer focus, bringing forth what helps everyone else because it's easier to adapt technology when innovation comes from addressing problems, and if it's problems that are directly impacting someone is more likely to embrace technology because it's there to help them and improve their workflow.
Yes. And we know we have the world has a growing population, and we need to do more with less. So we've got to figure out ways to do that.
For sure, and that does bring up one of the parts why this podcast exists is addressing and bringing awareness to careers in the agricultural, food industries and that because there is a labor shortage. And one of the things that I was actually curious to know from your opinion relating to that is just talking about when it comes to agriculture and in the food industry, for a lot of younger folks, even like myself, who have been raised in the suburbs or goes to school in the city, that it's really not something that I'm exposed to, or many people aren't. So they can become very far removed from agriculture to even consider going into it. And one of the things, this might have been a personal opinion to you, but how would you say that we can start to expose younger individuals to come work in these environments? Because if you come from the suburbs and then you go out and you want to work in a rural area, it can be a tough decision because you're uprooting your whole life. It's not just, I'm going to choose a different job in the city. So I
Yeah.
was curious if there was anything that you have seen that has been successful or maybe thoughts you've had on the process that might encourage this to happen.
Yeah, I would first off saying don't let the fact that you don't have a background in ag or knowledge about it deter you from pursuing an interest. I hope your listeners are hearing just the passion that I have for
Hmm.
agriculture and maybe seeing some of the opportunities within it. But, you know, we're a business just like everybody else. Yes, we need traders. So I've given you an example of kind of what that trade background looks like. We need accountants, we need financial analysts, marketing, communications, human resources, information technology, legal. We need all of that, just like every business really does. And the neat thing about working in the ag industry is that in those capacities, you are going to have exposure to learning about ag within those. You just will, because that will be the focus of what you're doing. There's a lot of learning on the job that way. I still, being 16 years, and I still have people come up and they've maybe been here 3 or 4 years or even more. And they said, I just want to learn more about what Scoular does. And they're successful in their careers at Scoular, but they just want to continue to learn more about what we do and how we serve our producers and our end users. And I think that's really exciting because it tells you two things. One, nobody's an expert and you don't have to be. It also tells you that here at Schooler, we have people that are vested in our business and we want to learn more about it. It's just really an exciting and dynamic industry. No 2 days are ever the same. You will never walk into a grocery store and not think differently about that. You will never see a train pass by and not think about, gosh, what's in that car, or how did that get here, or where's it going? I always say, what industry is affected by everything going on in the world? So call it weather, consumer demands, financial markets, politics, but then also affects everything in the world. You cannot live without it. And when I say agriculture, I mean, again, I'm talking a lot about grain production because that's what my background has been, but that's vegetables, that's pumpkins, it's cotton for clothing, it's everything. That's agriculture. Hopefully, I've shared with your listeners as to why it would be an exciting career. As far as ways to go about that, Future Farmers of America, you can find them online and they have organizations all over the United States. So you can look into that. Also, 4-H has locations throughout the United States, and those are two good organizations to start to help introduce the ag industry. County extension offices. So if you are even in the suburbs, but can reach out to those county extension offices, those could help. The universities, in most states, there's generally some sort of education institution that has a focus on ag. So certainly those. And then podcasts. That's the world that we live in. You can type in agriculture and there are so many different ag podcasts that come up, and listen to some and start to think about maybe where your interests lie. Is it in the trade environment that I'm describing? Is it more, I really want to maybe go down this path of communication? So how do I think about the communications, the social media aspect? Those are some ways that I would suggest.
No, those are really good, great pardon me. Those are really good, suggestions for those to look into it. Because 'cause you're right, there's a ton of great podcasts that are out there, and those associations are a great way to get a touch of what it is, because even just exposure at the beginning can help you really weed your way before you figure out if you want to maybe move out, and the industry is very vast, and we need everyone. But one thing that you mentioned that I really wanna echo is just the idea that when you get into agriculture and you get into food, not directly farming, is that I feel as though you get this more you become a more rounded person, to be honest, because everyone has to eat. And there's something that changes in you when you start to realize about who's producing what you're making and getting a better idea of the process. It really humanizes the food because many people say, oh, processed foods might not be processed foods are so far from removed, but there's so many hardworking individuals that have gone into it, and it really gives you this more holistic view of like how you fit in with that. And I love that about the industry.
Yes, and we've primarily been talking about food, fuel, ethanol,
Mm.
biodiesel, all of that feed, which ultimately ends up as food when you have feed ingredients for animals. But yeah, it's all around us and it's dynamic, and you know, it's just such an exciting time to be in it because of some of the other aspects that I shared with you, like on the sustainability and carbon and regen ag. I mean, ag is at the forefront to be able to influence a lot of what we see going forward in the future. And that's a really exciting time. That's just another thing folks can look at too. If they have interest, they can understand more about the carbon markets or more about regenerative ag or soil health. All of those dynamics come into play.
So one of the things that you've trickled upon throughout our conversation, and I have to make sure that I ask this because it stood out to me, is we've been talking about farmers. So I wanted to know, how does Schooler support farmers in communities? Because I know that's something that's really big for the organization. And as you having a background with coming where you grew up, I'd love to know how that is continuing to happen through Schooler.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right, Veronica. The farmer is at the heart of what we do. And we not only say that, we put that into practice. We do have an official, it's called the Scoular Foundation. It's a private philanthropic organization that we have created, which is just dedicated to enhancing the quality of human life in these communities that we work and operate in. Our employees work in these same communities and they live there too. So it's important for us to continue to advance that agricultural way of life and to be able to have those robust communities. Just to give you some examples of things, and it could be a really long list. I will condense it, but 4-H clubs, EMT and firefighter organizations, we donate to those. The Chamber of Commerce, various school booster clubs. I'm just trying to think of other things, teen centers, youth sports, community colleges. We are very active in the communities that we're in. And I would also just say from a perspective of bringing market knowledge to the producer, we have, back to that communication piece, we really work at having that communication between our facilities and our trade teams so we can bring that market knowledge and the producer can see that in terms of what we're able to offer them on pricing, on market knowledge, on just different solutions we can bring to not only our producers, but our end users. So we really hold that unique position in the ag industry. I describe it as we're big enough to be able to influence the market, but we're not too big that we can't be nimble to react to those market opportunities. And when you think about serving the producer, that's also a way that we serve the producer.
That's lovely because I think that's something that people forget as well when it comes to moving or going into new communities is these core community groups are what help you have a good life in general, not just from your job perspective, but just a more fulfilling life because our communities are at the heart of what makes you happy and you could have a great job, but if you come home and there's no like excess community, it could really affect you. So it's good to know that Schooler is helping to support these types of things.
Yes. Yeah, that's really important to us and we live that out every day.
For sure, and this would be a perfect opportunity for those to get involved or maybe get more interested in agriculture that they can start to learn more through these types of community organizations as well.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, this would actually be a nice time to touch upon it because I'm personally not too familiar with the topic of grain production. Would you be able to talk a little bit more about what it looks like, let's say, starting from the seed to maybe getting on your plate, if we're talking from a grain production going from a food consumption perspective?
Sure. I'm going to talk from a North American perspective and primarily the United States. The seed is planted generally in the spring. So that's going to be, depending on when you are, that's that February through June timeframe. The growing season is going to be roughly May through August. And then harvest is in the fall, and that's August through November. So those are, really the basic timeframes for corn, soybeans, milo, and wheat. I will just preface that too with winter wheat, which is the commodity that I had actually traded as when I traded. That's actually planted in the fall. So the winter wheat is planted in the fall. It goes dormant over the winter. It comes back to life in the spring, and then it's harvested like that June, July timeframe. So there's hard red winter wheat and there's soft red winter wheat. And depending upon where you are in the United States, generally west of the Mississippi is going to be hard red, and then generally east of the Mississippi is soft red. But there are some exceptions to that rule. But that's the growing seasons. So as far as getting that seed all the way to your plate. So think of the grain industry challenged with finding the most efficient way to get the seed to the plate or to an animal's mouth or to a fuel tank, if you're talking about fuel. There would be harvesters, combines that would combine that production. And then the grain, I said back to the efficiency part, the grain's going to go to the most efficient route. So sometimes that might mean going to a local place that has maybe truck access. Sometimes it might be going to a local processor who's going to actually then go process the grain into, you name it, crackers, bread, tortilla chips, all of those things. Sometimes it's to a place that's going to move it by rail. And maybe ultimately that rail does move to a processor in the United States. That would be called like domestic demand when it's processed in the United States. Or it may actually find its way to an export elevator. So United States exports grain to other countries. It would move the ships to export to other customers in other countries. Same demands that I'm describing in the United States, but it's just called export.
Okay.
So that's really the way that happens. But yeah, there's processing plants. So there's plants that are going to process corn, wheat, beans, milo, and then produce it into that food. So let's just say, for example, on wheat, because that's my most recent experience in trade, that kernel of wheat is going to ultimately move to a processor, a flour miller. They're going to mill that. And then now it's flour. So now a baker can do what they want with it. They can make crackers, they can make cookies, they can make flour tortilla chips. They can do whatever they need to do with it. So that's how that process works. And then ultimately gets on our store shelves.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Well, I've learned something new. I didn't know that there were like seasonal grains. Oh, sorry, was that how you described it? Or
Yeah, for the most part, the bulk of the commodities that we talk about in the United States, corn, soybeans, milo, wheat, those are that time frame that I described. So that spring, summer, fall. The winter wheat's the only kind of exception to that. But just along those lines, you're seeing that supply chain, about 8 cents of every dollar of product that you buy is actually like food costs going to grain production. The other 92 goes to that whole other supply chain process that I just described. And you think of packaging, transportation, retail, advertising. There's all these other pieces of it before you might see it at your store shelf. Now, granted, if you're buying from, say, a farmer's market or something like that, that might be able to change things, but more in this mass grain production and mass food production is what I'd be describing.
wow. Wow, that isn't that's a very small number. I can see why people are very much saying that we should be supporting our farmers more because I guess, yeah, it makes sense when you have all these individuals who are participating in the food chain that when it comes to the actual production, it starts to dwindle as you keep going. Wow.
Absolutely. Yep.
Wow. And one other thing I also wanted to ask was why is grain considered to be a commodity? Because that was something that kind of was hard for me to wrap my head around when I started learning about this subject. And I think you would be the best person to answer that.
It's generally because it's going to be pretty uniform. So there's grade standards for corn, for wheat, for milo, for beans. So it is fairly commoditized. Now, there are exceptions to that rule, certainly. So to make some of these products that I've described, you might need this certain quality of wheat or this certain protein of wheat. So those are exceptions, but for the most part, it is a pretty homogeneous, I shouldn't explain commodity with the word commodity, but it's a pretty homogeneous product is
Okay.
why the term commodity gets used, because it's pretty homogeneous and it's moving in like mass production. Some of these trains that I'm describing that we load at our shuttle facilities, they're going to load 110 to 120 rail cars. And that's going to be hauling between 400 and 450,000 bushels of grain. Monstrous. It's back to that efficiency standpoint, is finding the way to be able to get it in the most efficient manner to whatever the final consumption is going to be.
Okay, that makes more sense. Yes, because it's so hard for me to conceptualize like the combination of all these farmers coming together when it just seems so um like I when I think of grain, I do the first image that comes into my mind is one farmer and their grain coming towards it, but there's a lot people eat a lot of grains.
Yeah, they do. And it starts with one farmer, a combination of several one farmers. So yeah, it's really getting that efficient way. That partnership I mentioned, Scoular is really involved in that transportation piece. A lot of that it's trucking and it's also rail. And to the extent sometimes it does move by ships if it's going for export.
That makes sense. One thing I did also again wanted to shift the conversation back to you and just put a little focus because I do like to look at your individual, you as an individual in your career. And we talked about how you've developed through your career. And I wanted to know where it goes from here. And what skills are you currently working on now that you're thinking that will better benefit you for this career?
Yeah, I'm going to come back to the communication. Like
Okay.
that is just an ongoing, and especially as I'm seeing new opportunities to communicate in different ways to not only the same folks that I have at Scoular, but to also different folks at Scoular, just in this new capacity. So definitely communication, different modes of communication. So sometimes it's PowerPoint, sometimes it's presentations. All of that plays into it. And then just in different conversations that we're having to, like I said before, keep consistent, but be able to adapt to the different conversations that are being had. So I would say communication is always going to be on my number one list. But as far as maybe some other things, I've always been a very organized person, but I've had to take it to a different, I don't want to say level necessarily, but just a different aspect right now, because I do have a lot of different pieces to think about and to manage. A lot in the trade environment, while we were looking out forward and looking at markets out forward, and then the deferred months, most of the opportunity was within the logistics that we were doing day to day, week to week, month to month. So we were constantly, and we do constantly manage logistics to make sure that supply chain stays fluid. In my role now, it's a lot of that forward thinking. So it's a lot of thinking about strategy. It's thinking about people management. It's thinking about resource design. It's thinking about new opportunities. So that has definitely been a shift in mindset. And I'm not going to tell you I'm an expert. I'm
Mhm.
learning as I go, but that has been a really big opportunity for me, and just learning from various folks and mentors within Schooler on how they've either they're navigated that with a similar career path that I did, or maybe things that they've seen that work or that don't work. So that organization and that forward thinking, but just thinking about things differently, I would say are two main ones. Another one for me too is just finding time to read different books. I've always preferred reading versus like watching TV, but a lot of times it was fiction books. And now I alternate between those and then just various business development books that help me think about things a little bit differently. As far as what's next on my plate at Schooler, I don't know. I'm in this one for a while here, and I don't know where that will take me, but I'm really thankful to be a part of the organization where I get to help influence what Schooler's path looks like going forward, especially as it relates to advancing our producers.
It's really great for you again to mention those types of things because it does show that there's roles outside of where anyone's thinking could even be on the radar, because I know I would never know that your career existed coming out of school and seeing these skills. Maybe someone is really being into like they have a skill set for staying organized and all that, and that can take them far in a career in something that really matches them, and you never know where it's going to take you. And as well with what you mentioned, you're gonna have your hands busy with talking about like technology, regenerative agriculture, like all those things are such it's not that they haven't been discussed in the past, because I know that there's always been a need for those types of things, but really pushing it to the forefront after you have the like fundamentals nailed, like it's a really exciting time for the to blending all these different initiatives at once.
It is. And back to that point of, oh, I don't have a history or I don't know how the ag industry has always done it in the past. That's going to continue to evolve. So how something was maybe done in the past won't necessarily be the way that it's always done in the future. So also just having that open, innovative, creative mind.
Oh, again, that's a really good point as well because with things changing, the industry changing, you might be the person that helps shift it to a better idea because you have a different perspective that's outside and it could really blend you into the organization. So there's always a role for everyone.
Yes, definitely.
Excellent. So I think that I am going to end our conversation there because I think that coming back to your effective communication, you have put so much information out in such a discreet, pardon me, in such a concise way that I think that I need to let the listeners like let it sink in with them
Absorb.
because yes, because honestly, my mind's racing and I just think I want to leave it at that because I've really learned a lot. So I wanted to say thank you so much, Melissa, for taking the time to come on the show. I thought that this was a packful conversation that I learned so much, and I hope that our listeners did too, because I think one of the things that was echoed throughout this episode is just being able to actively communicate, but also that agriculture needs everyone. You don't necessarily have to go on the farm to support farmers or be a part of it, and you can really have this very fulfilling career if you want to be in agriculture. So thank you.
Yes. Yeah, no, I appreciate you having me and be able to talk a little bit more about ag and share some insight on Scoular.
That was episode 46 of the FoodGrads Podcast. All the notes to this podcast can be found on the FoodGrads blog or by clicking on the Student and Grads tab on the homepage. There you can find any notes to past or future episodes. I would also like to give a shout out and a thank you to our friends at agcareers.com for connecting us with Scoular. If you're interested in a career in agriculture and food, then check out thousands of job opportunities on www.agcareers.com, agcareers.com. That was a great episode and I learned so much from Melissa. It is always interesting to learn more about like higher up roles in an organization, what exactly they entail, and how they shape an organization. It really gives perspectives on how there can be so many places you can go and grow within your career. You can move laterally, upwards, backwards, depending on what works best for you. After all, you never know where life is going to take you. I think this also highlights the fact that the agricultural industry is huge and is always looking for folks from all walks of life. You can be someone who comes from the suburbs or even the city. So even if growing up you didn't grow up on a family farm or something like that, that is fine because the agricultural industry is looking for everyone. All you have to do is show an interest for agriculture and let your skills take you from there because they're always looking for unique individuals. Anyways, that's it for this week's episode. Thank you everyone so much for listening and I will see you next time.